You've already heard about two social reformers, three from the Bible. I'm going to do a talk on Pandita Ramabai. How many of you have heard of Pandita Ramabai before? Jonathan, who heard about Pandita Ramabai after I mentioned it to him. But have you heard of her? No. I was thinking maybe I should did I get all my notes right when I saw you? I thought, I can say whatever I want. If you could pass this to the back row. Those are my notes. I'm really sorry that they are so tiny, some of the font, but hopefully you're... Okay, that's good that most of you have not heard of her. How many of you have been to India? So there's been quite a few of you have been to India, so at least you know a bit of India when I start talking about things like caste and stuff like that. But good. If I got all my notes in order here. I'm going to take about 15 minutes. Only 15 minutes. I really want to give time for discussion. So if I go over the points quickly, hopefully you can get a chance to ask me later, or we won't have too much question and answer time unless it's you really want some questions. Okay, so Pandita Ramabai, Indian social reformer. I did tell Jonathan we do want to look at somebody from outside the West. We've looked at someone from England, someone from Europe, and someone from international. So we thought you wanted to look at somebody outside of the West. She's a woman who is a remarkable woman. So this is what you'd hear about her. She was born on the 23rd of April, 1858, and died on the 5th of April, 1922, on my birthday, before I was born. She was 5 foot tall. She was quite, she was not the sort of a dominating woman, but man, she was somebody that had courage. There was a lot of social reform going on in the world at that time in the 19th century. There was a lot of revival that had taken place in the US. There was social reform in the US. There was social reform going on here in Europe during the Victorian era. But there was also social reform going on in India at that time. So it is in that context that you have to understand her life. She is known for having played a huge role in fighting against the oppression of women, fighting against the caste system. She was a pioneer in modern education. And the more I've read about her life, I've come away quite struck by the fact that most people in India might have heard of her name but don't know anything about her. We don't talk about her in the church. For some reason, she's unknown. I never heard about her until I came here to the West. So she was given the title Pandit. If you know the name of the first prime minister that India had, his name was also Pandit. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. Pandit simply is what you would say here as professor. Somebody who's distinguished in learning. So a bit of background to India. India at that time was predominantly a Hindu country, which means that there was this world in which people believed things that were just given. I think it would be fair to say that Hinduism does take a social order as a given. And you don't violate caste boundaries, you don't violate things. It's not sort of an individualist society. It's given and you just accept it. India at that time was also being ruled by the British, and therefore Indians were in a society that, the Brits were making the decisions for the Indians at that time. You had the caste system, and then you had all these social evils that I've mentioned a few here, like child marriage. Children as young as 6 or 7 were given in marriage. In fact, Pandita Ramabai's mother, Lakshmi Bai, was 9 years old when she married as the second wife to her father, who was 44 at that time. And also there was a lot of Christian mission work going on. Schools were being started. The school and college that I went to in India was founded by British missionaries. So there was a lot of things going on in India at that time. And particularly in like Bengal, in the area where there's Bangladesh now, there was a lot of reform movements going on. You might have come across a name like Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And there was a sort of Bengali renaissance that was going on with literature and a sort of Hindu reform that was going on in India. So it is in that context that we understand her life. Now the thing about Pandita Ramabai that I want to shape this talk around not just about her, but about how God uses life's circumstances to shape a reformer. How nothing in your life in the end is wasted. And her life was, the hardship that she went through is mind-boggling. So let's talk a little bit about her life. She came from a Brahmin family, which means they are the highest caste in the social order, which means it is only the Brahmins that can attain salvation. And so she was born into a Brahmin family. Her father was a scholar, somebody who would read the scriptures in public places to earn some money. And his name was Anant Shastri Donga. And he would basically travel around India with his family, earning some money, reading the scriptures outside the temples, and people would give them money. He was one time in the kingdom of Nepal, and the king was so impressed with his knowledge of the scriptures that he gave him a vast amount of land and elephants and stuff like that. And Pandita Ramabai's father was a man that believed in the sort of noble life. You know, there was this concept that you had to give your life away in service. So he basically spent all that money giving hospitality to people that were coming on pilgrimage, and lost everything. They basically lived most of their life poor. And Pandita Ramabai saw that as being the fault of the sort of religion that he believed in which she was not allowed to have any. They were not allowed to have any possessions. She was the last child to Lakshmi Bai. This is her mother, and her name was Rama, which simply means bright. And she did have quite a light skin as well. I've read. In 1874, there was a huge famine across India. There was a lot of famines that took. I mean, there was, if you do famines in India in the 19th century, there were several famines that took place, and vast numbers of people died across India. In one of the famines in 1874, her family died. Ramabai was 16 years old. Her mother died, her father died, her mother died, and her siblings died, and then she was left with her brother. And after the death of her family, she and her brother basically walked around India from the south to the north, begging in temples. And she writes in her biography that they walked 4,000 miles across India. How she did this, I have no idea. As a 16-year-old girl who was not married, she only had a brother, but she did it because there were things that she knew about India that could only come if she had visited. In the same year, in 1880, about 6 years after her parents had died, her brother dies. And she knew for an Indian woman, not having a father, not having a brother, not having a son, is the end of your life. You can't have a life if there's no man in your life. And we're talking about 100 years ago. She married, because of the courage of conviction that she had, she married a lower caste, a Sudra lawyer, a man whose name was Bipin Das. And they had a daughter together named Manorama. Sadly, 2 years later, he dies, and she becomes a widow. She was married for 2 years, and a widow in India at that time would have to shave her hair off, wear white clothes, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, and basically disappear. She had no visibility in society once she became a widow. But Ramabai refuses to become invisible. In fact, it only becomes for her the conviction that she was meant to do something about the fact that the plight of the Indian woman was this bad. I find it hard to believe, but it is true. It was this bad. The one thing she had going for her in her life was that she was bright, not just in the terms of her skin complexion, but she was intellectually bright. By the time she was 16 years old, she had memorized 18,000 verses of the Hindu scriptures by heart. Her father, for some reason, had the view that women could be taught the scriptures, which was completely unacceptable. In fact, there was one point he had to be brought before the priest in a temple, and they were going to reject him from the caste system because the father was teaching his wife and the daughters the scriptures. But he somehow argued that there was nothing he found in the scriptures. In fact, her father knew more of the scriptures than the priest, and said the scriptures doesn't forbid women from learning. And so Pandit Ramabai, at the age of 20, when she was in Calcutta, was brought before a council of very learned Hindu scholars, and they found that she was one of the most brilliant women who knew the scriptures, and they gave her the title Pandit. And at that point, she began to teach. She was a woman that was teaching young boys Hindu scriptures. So there is a sort of reform going on within Hinduism as well. Now, at this point in Calcutta, something begins to happen. This is where the sovereign hand of God was on her life. There in Calcutta, she meets some Christians, some Western missionaries, who invited her to a prayer meeting. And one of the things that struck her was that there were Indian women there that were eating the white people's food. And they were all praying together. They all knelt on the ground and and she couldn't understand this. And then she gets a copy of the Sanskrit Bible. Somebody gave her a copy of the Sanskrit Bible and she started to read it, but was very unconvinced about anything she read. I think she started with Genesis and it didn't make any sense to her. In 1883, she has the opportunity to travel to England to study medicine. She came here to England because she wanted to study medicine, because she was basically interested in providing health care for women and children, young girls that didn't have access to health care. And one of the things that happened to her with these sisters that she was staying with, she was deeply impacted by the Anglican sisters and their care for the poor. Let me read 2 quotes for you from her writings. This is about how Indian men look at women. In 1882, she wrote, Men look on us women as chattels. We make every effort to deliver ourselves from this situation. But some will say that this is rebellion against man, and to do this is sin. To leave men's evil acts unrebuked and remain unmoved before them is a great sin. This is what she was saying about the relationship of men and women in India. This is what she wrote when she came to England with the sisters in the Anglican Church at the place where she had her baptism in Wantage. Here for the first time I came to know that something should be done to reclaim the so-called fallen women, and that Christians, whom Hindus considered outcast and cruel, were kind to these unfortunate women, degraded in the eyes of society. I had never heard or seen anything of the kind done for this class of women by Hindus in my own country. Of course, she had promised before she left India that she will not convert to Christianity. But while she was here, particularly one of her close Indian friends here committed suicide because of something that had happened back in India. And on the 29th of September in 1883, she was baptized in the parish church in Wantage. And I think made an intellectual conversion. She was intellectually compelled by the mission work and by the women that were doing the work. From 1886 to 1888, she traveled to the US and spoke at hundreds of gatherings, mobilizing support for what she wanted to do when she went back to India to help Indian women. And she at that point published this famous book called The High Caste Indian Women. So a little bit about her efforts and struggles in social reform. So there were a couple of things here that happened before she left to go to the US, and then there's a few things that she started doing after she came back. So even before she left to go to England, America, she started something called the Arya Mahala Samaj, called Noble Women's Society. The purpose of the society was to promote the cause of women's education and deliverance from the oppression of child marriage. Her one of the things she was campaigning for, or she wanted, was that women should be able to have some say in who they married, and that they should be able to wait a bit before they got married. She wanted them to be a bit older. She also became aware that it was not just that women had these problems, but that men had put in place a system that kept women in this subjugated position. So she was also constantly trying to expose the double standards in which men were keeping women oppressed. There was one point she got herself into a lot of trouble when she started showing how many of these widowed women, young girls, were actually then sent to temples where the priests were actually sexually exploiting them. She was asked to come and give a sort of evidence to a commission set up by Lord Ripon, who was the Viceroy of India at that time, for education of Indians. And she gave evidence, and this is what she said. In 99 cases out of 100, the educated men of this country are opposed to female education and the proper position of women. If they observe the slightest fault, they magnify the grain of mustard seed into a mountain and try to ruin the character of a woman. She didn't make a lot of friends, but somehow because she was a high caste Brahmin woman and because she was so brilliant, they couldn't dismiss her. They had to deal with her. She also started another house called Sarada Sadan before she left to travel. Oh no, after she came back, she started this house of learning in which she wanted to set up a place not to convert people, but just to give them good education, give them some training so that they can get a job. But something happened in her life in 1891 that I think is very significant, which I do want to say a few things about. when she was in England, she did go to the Keswick Convention. If you know anything about the Keswick Convention, there are these conventions that take place in the summer here in England, in a place called Keswick, where there was a lot of teaching on the deeper life in Christ. And when she was here in England, she did speak at that convention about Indian women and wanting to help Indian women. But she herself had not had a kind of a heart conversion. So it was almost, between the first time in Calcutta when she went to that prayer meeting to 1891, it was a long journey for her before she had a deep conversion to Christ. Her prayer life changes. She almost had a revival in these centers that she had started, where people were gathering together and waiting on God and praying. And I think one thing I want to say about Ramabai's life that really struck me over the last week as I was preparing is that you cannot separate prayer and social transformation. And it's very difficult because in some ways social transformation is about the material world, it's about human beings and institutions. And prayer is about the spiritual world. And yet Ramabai realizes that after that experience that she had, her work actually changes. God, there was provision, there was significant impact. Again, circumstances outside of her own control, in 1896, there was again another famine in India. And she basically, along with the women that were working in her in these centers, went with bullock carts, these carts that cows pull, and traveled across the state of Maharashtra, bringing anybody and everybody to these centers to provide for them and care for them, because most of these widowed lower caste women didn't have anywhere to go. They were just going to die on the streets. There were literally people dying on the streets. And anybody that was still sort of alive, she would bring them to this center to care for them. The center that she started was called Mukti Sadan, which means House of Salvation, which is still there today, that place, called Ramabai Bhakti Mission. By 1990, there were 2,000 women and children living at these centers. They were fed and clothed, they were given medical care, and after they had recovered their health, they were often given training to be able to get some job, and they were taught the Bible. So it was a sort of holistic empowerment and development work that they were doing, that she was doing. She faced incredible criticism for converting people, but she refused to back down, and she believed that Christ had to be presented as the ultimate answer to man's condition, or human being's condition. Because early on, before she had that conversion in 91, she was very happy to have her own prayers inside her. She would shut her room and pray with only a few believers. But after this conversion, this deeper conversion that she had, she would keep her doors and windows open, and anybody in the centers that she had could come and join in the prayer. And there were times in the morning where there were 200 people praying at these centers. So to finish, so I've just gone a bit over time. Let's just finish with about her legacy. She is probably the only woman who has translated the entire Bible from its original Greek and Hebrew into a vernacular language. That she did in the last years of her life. She learned Greek and Hebrew so that she could translate the Bible. Because at that time, I think a lot of the people had to read the Bible in Sanskrit, which was the language of the elite. It was like Latin. And like what Martin Luther did of translating the Bible into, or Tyndale translating the Bible into English. She wanted the people in Maharashtra to read the Bible in Marathi, and she translated the whole of the scriptures. And at one point, I think they had distributed over 10,000 Marathi Bibles in Maharashtra. She was given a medal by the British government in 1919 for her community service, and then in 1989 the government of India issued a commemorative stamp to remember her, and also named her the Woman of the Millennium. For an Indian government to do that is incredible. There are still about 1,000 people there in that mission today who are being cared for. Women, often you would meet people in India who they would say, I grew up there. Particularly if you go to the state of Maharashtra, many women who are orphans, girls who are orphans, grew up in Ramabai Bhakti Mission. So let me finish with a quote from her that I think captures some of what we are going to be discussing in the next 4 days here. People must not only hear the kingdom of God, but must see it in actual operation, on a small scale perhaps, and in imperfect form, but a real demonstration nevertheless. And she lived this. She demonstrated that the kingdom of God is about what you do. Thank you.